looking like breeze.
So listen, good afternoon, everybody. Well, with us today are Kate Kuehn, Senior Vice President with vArmour, and we're here to talk about modern network security. We've had several important considerations and themes crop up in our last couple of episodes on this. One, that MDR and XDR solutions are really benefiting from AI and machine learning analysis of what are acceptable baselines and then looking for those patterns and deviations. That everything detection and response has been really benefiting from those two technologies and the level of data that it's allowed us to chew through and pattern recognition. Larger sample sizes, better outcomes. Logging and alerts are only as good as the actions that they invoke. And the same goes for SOC and SIM, right? Because that's where you're sending your logging and alerting and you're looking for aggregation and correlation. And those are great preventative measures, but unless they invoke action based on intelligent decisions, logging, alerts, SOC and SIM, they're not going to give you the value that you think. And then finally, and this obviously should seem like table stakes for most of us, but one of the things that has come up in our past two discussions is that digital identity is probably more crucial now than it ever has been before because of this attack-rich environment and how everything that we do, we've been in a digital age for a long time, but I think we're really seeing a lot of this kind of come to a head. And now everything is being driven very digitally, much more than it ever has been before in a global economy, scale. And that digital identity, that fingerprint, that thumbprint, what makes you in a cyber world is now more important than ever it has been before. And so that's kind of mimetic because today we've got with us vArmour, who has a very interesting niche in the market. And I'm going to turn this over to Kate and ask her to introduce herself and talk to us a little bit about what vArmour does, especially around applications and identity and bringing it kind of all together. So Kate, why don't you say hi and tell us a little bit about yourself and vArmour.
Hey, Dave, nice to meet you. And thanks for having me on. Very excited to be a part of this podcast. So I'm Kate Kuehn. I have been a security practitioner or in security for about 20 plus years. For vArmour, I am honored enough to run the Channel and Alliance program, as well as some of the business development for the company. And what we do and who we are is we are the leaders in application relationship management. And if you think about what you were just talking about, and I was smiling as you were talking about the XDR and the MDR market and some of the current events and the new drivers of where the market's headed, we kind of take it from a different lens. So we believe that relationships and the interdependencies between relationships from a data perspective, a workflow perspective, looking from the inside out is really critical of understanding, not only from an instant response perspective, but in that whole digitization you were just talking about, that drive to digital. If you don't understand who's talking to who, what's talking to who, and what's talking to what, then you're going to be susceptible to the attacks we've seen. And that's where vArmour really comes in and shines. We're that Google Earth, that map of understanding and the ability to enforce policy around what and who is able to talk and to interact within an environment.
We have talked, one of our discussion points that I think we come across a little, it comes across a little bit, but indirectly, how everybody talks about defense in depth, and defense in depth isn't new. And we bring up, SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, right? These large scale hacks that have happened, that have been brought to the public eye. And we talk about defense in depth and how it's not new. And yet, look at these things that are still happening because people, aren't walking the walk, even though they're talking the talk in some cases, or sometimes they're not, or not as well. They're not walking the walk as well as, or maturely as they should be. Maturely. I don't even know if that's a word, but we're going to go with it.
I won't correct you one way or another.
Well, I appreciate it. But then, things like this happen and, and you're left wondering a little bit. And so we've talked about how defense in depth isn't enough anymore. And then I think where we're really coming to is overactive visibility or hyper visibility or hyper care is almost kind of what's required today so that you can plan effectively and actually mitigate risk. And I think some of that comes from because of the fact that I don't think cybersecurity has ever been given its day in the sunshine and shown the amount of importance that it's supposed to have. What do you think?
Oh, I'm going to disagree with you on a couple of levels there. So let's just have some fun. Defense in depth is a term that, it's actually another podcast that I listen to on a regular basis. Defense in depth as a concept in security, you can either go, to your point, as a practitioner really light or beyond the pale. I've run into peers who've literally bought every solution under the sun thinking that that's still defense in depth and that's going to save them from the bad guys. When you think about hypervisibility, let's just peel back the onion for a second. When looking at SolarWinds, when looking at what just happened, with Colonial and others, those are very specific examples of a type of attack we call a supply chain attack. And the critical difference, the supply chain attacks have been around for years. Target was originally a supply chain attack. We've seen them for better part of 10 years being in the hacker's arsenal. But the reality is they're difficult to execute. And the key differential when thinking about a supply chain attack is that it's a malicious piece of code, or it's something nefarious that enables a hacker to get beyond the trusted perimeter and infect within what would be considered the zone of safe. That is very difficult. It's scary and it's really hard to protect. So when you think about defense in depth, you can buy every tool under the sun, but we are traditionally used to defending our perimeter. And what we're finding is not that security hasn't had its day in the sun, because I'll tell you, on the boards I sit on, one of the biggest limitations is you could spend every dollar a company makes on security. It's, are you protecting the right way? And do you understand your own estate? The reality of the situation is that 80% of organizations, and I just gave a talk on this not long ago, don't have a firm handle on what their crown jewels are. So let's start there.
I'm talking about risk.
If you don't know what you're supposed to be protecting and the risk if it's compromised, you don't know where to spend the money. Let's start right there. The second piece is, in the last 12 to 18 months, and this is a direct result of the digitization you were just talking about, of COVID, all those types of scenarios that have caused these black swan events, we've seen a huge shift in the industry, and we talk about it at vArmour all the time, from static-based security to dynamic security, and event-based security to relational-based security. So that event-based, we're going to care and feed a SIM, we're going to protect our perimeter, we're going to defend our borders, we'll catch 80% of the bad guys. That's gone away. You have to be able to understand real time the interdependencies and be able to react with an enhanced eye on what's actually happening within an estate. That's the only way you're going to stop the subtle nuances of this. It's not a new type of attack, but a more popular, in essence, tool that the hackers are using in their arsenal right now. So no, I don't think defense in depth is something that we should be focusing more on. I think it's a question of we need to change our definition of defense. On the second point, I don't think it's a question that security's not had its day in the sun, because I'll tell you, a lot of companies have tool fatigue and budget fatigue when it comes to security. It's being intelligent around understanding the estate, and from there, correlating that to new, more dynamic, real-time, best-case security practices.
Those are excellent points. And it's funny that you brought both of those up, because anybody that's listened to this podcast, at least in this particular series on modern network security, has heard me say almost the same thing, although you did a much more eloquent job of it. I will give you that.
Oh, thank you.
But that, the risk-based analysis, right? Where is my risk? What are the potential types of attacks that risk could come under, right? And then let's seal those up. I've been preaching that ever since we started this series, and for a long time now. I've only been doing cybersecurity for a little over 10 years, so not quite as long as yourself. I feel like an infant, actually, on this phone call.
You actually haven't hit dinosaur status like me.
I'm sure you've forgotten more than I've learned. But being able to perform a risk analysis or a risk assessment and then understand what you need to protect so that you don't buy the wrong tools or just get this death by tool, as I call it, is so important, right? And I guess I don't even associate good cybersecurity with tools anymore. I always think about it in terms of, well, what do we need to protect and why do we need to protect it? Is it due care? Is it, compliance related? Is it, some sort of regulatory body? What is causing us to feel that we need to protect this information?
I'm going to stop you there for a second because it's important. Everybody kind of says that right now in security. And I just had a really long talk with a good friend of mine who's been a CISO in the Asia Pac market for a number of years now, mainly in the financial sector. And we were talking about that the concept of security tools has become unpopular, and everybody kind of gravitates, like you were just talking about, to, you have frameworks and you have policies, and let's look at compliance and what is the definition of risk. But The reality of the situation is that there still are humans and boxes and SaaS solutions and things necessary to make all that vision work. And the point I want to get across on this, especially as we look to, the newest buzzword du jour, like, ZTA, Zero Trust Architecture, is it isn't just one box, one tool. It's a question, and I think this is one of the areas, when you look at modern security, you have to drive to, is that it takes an ecosystem of solutions. And I'm very proud that vArmour is one of those solutions that, one, we're agentless, and then we can hook into everybody else's, NetFlow and APIs, because we understand that, to your point, practitioners don't want to buy one more tool. We don't want to lay down one more agent, but we want to get more out of the investments we've made and create a more robust architecture, leveraging the ROIs we've already invested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the whole idea of capturing this NetFlow data and then, aggregating it and correlating it with additional data points, right? So that you can see what's happening. And I think that's where vArmour really kind of hits the nail on the head too, is combining all that network traffic that you're collecting, that network data, and then wrapping in the identity providers, who's accessing what systems, and then what are those systems communicating with. In my mind, I always picture a whiteboard where I can start drawing those red lines to say, here's my boundary, right? Here's my perimeter. I need to protect this. And what do I need to do to make sure that those communications stay controlled?
I love the whiteboard, and I love the fact that you're thinking in that way, workload to workload. But here's the thing. I need you to grab the dry erase marker and erase that perimeter, because the perimeter's gone.
That's really, the fuzzy perimeter. We've talked a lot about that too. So what do we do? So what's the next step? So, we need visibility, but we don't want to do, we don't want to have all these extra tools. How are you guys approaching this? And what's your attack on the market look like?
My first advice is to buy vArmour. I mean, let's
of course.
In all seriousness, so it's funny you talk about, like, well, what do we do? Having been a practitioner and having been on both sides of the fence, both as a customer in my own right and as a vendor, I was floored by the idea of relational-based security and how important the correlation between applications, app to user, app to app was, to the point that when I saw the latest release of App Controller from vArmour almost 2 years ago now, I actually, honest to God, called the CEO up and asked to get on the bus. I'm like, what can I do? How can I help? What kind of job can you give me? Because I'm that passionate about the tech. When you think about outside of, me being a commercial for vArmour, here's why I'm passionate about it, is one of the biggest blind spots, whether you're trying to rapidly migrate to the cloud, whether you're trying to enhance more of a real-time incident response, whether you are looking at from a compliance lens, or if you're just trying to harness from a digital, transformation perspective, what you can do from an identity and to your point, that identity-driven digitization, it all lands in this concept of visibility. What I mean by that is, if you don't have a firm handle on what's happening in the estate, and that's the dirty secret, is we just don't know. And the reason is, if you think about security and you think about identity and you think about, even traditional CMDB and GRC tools, they have one common, in essence, thread, and that's data. Data is the ending and the beginning of all good security practice. So if you don't know and understand where your data resides, who's accessing it, how are applications utilizing it, and where is it being stored, you've lost half the battle of good security. And so from a vArmour perspective, we took a look at identity and to your point, the MDR and the XDR markets out there. And here's my common problem with all of them. What line did I just make you erase around your fuzzy little whiteboard?
Hopefully, I'd like to say none on my drawing, because I would have understood that there was data there that needed to be protected. So hopefully I wouldn't have drawn a bad line. But
the perimeter. So
no, I was being funny. I see your point, right? There is no line.
So that perimeter, all those solutions we just talked about, if you think about it from an identity, from an IAM perspective, when you're thinking about digital identity, if you look at it from an XDR and MDR, what direction do they come in? Do they look external to internal or internal to external?
Well, that's been our problem. So almost ubiquitously across the board, they're looking external to internal, right?
Correct.
Which is a problem. It's a real problem. That's part of it. We talked a lot about, command and control. And if you were paying attention to what was leaving, what's breaking a communication pattern, a non-traditional communication pattern, right? You would have been a lot better off.
And that's the difference with vArmour is we are able to leverage your traditional, solution set, whether it be, your IAMs, your MDRs, your XDRs, and yet still look from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
So we can take your tools, if it's from a CMDB, a GRC like an Archer, your Taniums, your Tufins, your Gigamons, all the way down to, even your cloud estates, thinking about, AWS and Microsoft, or even looking at like a VMware and a Nutanix. We can take all of that and give you that visibility to understand not only your traditional external perimeter based world, but that internal to external correlation.
I think that's the first time that we've had someone, a guest on the podcast that said that, hey, we're really focused on trying to make sure that we catch that inside out, right? With a high level of certainty. Like that's what we're purpose built trying to accomplish, or one of our purposes, which is interesting, so maybe we're at another turning point where we really need to go the step farther, and we need to do a better job at correlating and aggregating our traditional SIM data. And vArmour is getting ahead of the curve, right? Maybe you guys are setting the pathway for what the Q radars and the Splunks and other people of the world are trying to do with their SIM solutions these days.
Well, I don't think it's a question of, we can partner with Q radar, we can partner with Splunk. It's not a question of that's where they're headed. It's a question of when you think about, we want to be able to visualize and enforce anything, anywhere, at any time. And that's kind of where we head. There's room at this moment in the market. My husband's a Splunk engineer for a large healthcare company. There's a lot of viability in those tools still. Our, existence is around creating new ways and new patterns of interconnection, and also extending the life cycle of that ROI.
Do you think that visibility of, the inside to out, right, the outbound communications, do you think that that's been a common lapse in visibility, logging, and alerting in, common security implementations?
I do. I think it's something that we do not spend enough time on. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Right now, if you were to take every breach in the past year, 52% of them would have been malicious in nature from an external threat. 52%. That's a big number. But that also means that 48% are coming from other sources, whether it's a malicious insider, an accident, or just being really, really silly. And so if you think about that, you have almost a 50-50 split. So understanding inside, whether it's a malicious insider that's taking data and exfiltrating it out, that's one problem. Or you've had a supply chain attack and they've gotten past and breached your system and they're already inside. You're not going to catch that with your traditional MDRs and XDRs and everybody that wants to say they're enhanced, because they're already there. And then the third thing is this stupid accident. You have a well-intentioned, sysadmin helping to install a zero trust architecture, and they put in 3 super users because, what if it goes wrong? Well, it's a complete antithesis of ZTA, but all of a sudden you've got a backdoor you didn't know about, and it gets exploited because somebody gets a wonderful piece of malware on their kid's laptop that's connected to the same Wi-Fi network as your mission control, because we're all working from home.
Yeah.
Those are the scenarios where that external in, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And it's not that those tools aren't viable, because you still have to defend what I would consider flexible perimeter. It's no longer brick and mortar. You still have to understand what's coming in, but you better spend almost more time at this moment looking at what's going out and why.
The whole concept of, I need to know what is supposed to be talking to what on a good day, and then looking for what changed. Why is that all of a sudden doing something it didn't do before? That thought has come up several times, but being able to have an actual solution to it under a consolidated, management plane like vArmour is, I think it says something, right? I think it says something to your passion, and I think it says something to the fact that your company's bothered to put the development and the time into this. And you're not just aggregating data and throwing, in a simple way. You guys are taking in a lot of different data sources from a lot of different places, and you've got some significant intelligence built into the system, as I understand it, right?
We do. We have an amazing ML AI capability and actually have Center of Excellence up in Calgary. And we're constantly looking at how we can enrich. We want to go beyond just traditional tagging and being able to be flexible to allow our customers to kind of see and visualize data in almost any way they want from a relational standpoint. But we want to be able to, and we are able to, utilize ML and AI to make predictive analysis of what we should be focusing on and how things could go wrong or go right, depending on what the scenario is. The typical road to visibility has been, for many large organizations, in essence, spreadsheets and guesses. And we've had a lot of customers say, you make a task that would take us usually 6 months and 200 people be less than 6 weeks, sometimes 6 hours. And that's what's so magical about, when you think about true visibility, is it empowers you from a real-time perspective to make intelligent decisions that impact that rest of that risk portfolio we were just talking about that enterprises are trying to grapple with right now.
It's amazing stuff. I'm glad that this episode ended up where it did in the series, because you're kind of bringing together a lot of the ideas and concepts that we've talked about, with some of our other partners and even our own services, and what we're counseling our customers with in terms of setting up a defense in depth strategy or a right-sized security program for their organization. But then to bring it all together like this and kind of have that deeper level of visibility, very focused on the application to application and user to application communication, and then looking for variances to baselines and differences there. And you guys can ingest almost anything, right? I mean, you can ingest vulnerabilities, you can ingest SOC and SIM data. You've obviously got your NetFlow identity. You're collecting all kinds of stuff and then building a level of intelligence on rather large data set.
We've been lovingly called the Hoover of data.
Right.
So I'm sure I like being likened to a vacuum, but I'll take it. It's all good.
It's amazing. So, you mentioned zero trust, and that's something that we haven't picked on a whole lot today. So zero trust is not necessarily new. It's been out there for a while, but I think a lot of different people have a lot of different definitions of what it means to them. So I'd love to hear about your philosophy on zero trust and, what is it to you? Why is it important, that definition? And then also, is zero trust achievable in the SMB, in the mid-market? Is it really reserved for the enterprise? And what do you think the journey looks like to get there?
So, it's one of my favorite topics to pick on right now because it's so necessary. And it's at this moment also so overblown. So I'm going to start with the baseline. Zero trust is not a solution. It's not a product. It's not a pretty little box. And it's not something that you can just set it and forget it. That's not what zero trust is. Zero trust architecture is really, if you've been in security for a while, every time I talk about this with my peers, we all kind of smile and laugh. It's least privilege access on steroids. It's been around forever, but it is an architectural framework for security theory that was not all that popular up until a recent time frame, because it took such an investment and commitment for enterprise to actually adhere to. The idea of trust no one in our culture is a very difficult pill to swallow. We much prefer trust no one, but accept a couple few, the exalted few.
I think it became synonymous with security through obscurity, and people kind of shied away from it naturally.
And to your point, that obscurity, what have we been talking about? Visibility. If you can't raise your hand unequivocally and say, I understand my complete estate, you are never going to be able to achieve zero trust. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast.
Good point.
So when I look at zero trust, I look at it two things. First, I smile and just in the back of my head go least privilege access on steroids, because that's what it is. And then I think about the actual benefits of it. I am a huge fan of zero trust. I really do, from a security practitioner standpoint, stand behind the concept of trust no one and verify everything, because you never know. We are all creatures of habit, and our blurred lines of personal and private data at this moment are just too wobbly because of work from home and flexible situations and this rapid digitization, that it's not any organization or individual's fault. We just are not in a scenario right now. If you think of all of the CVEs and even now the executive order that have culminated as a result of the attacks we've been under the past year, to really look at any type of trust, we just have to go to a no trust model. For an SMB and a mid-market, I think it's almost easier. You have a much more clear-cut line of, I have 8 applications, 15 users, 3 third parties that touch my network. It's a much easier picture to understand. It's taking the gulp and saying, I'm not going to trust anyone within that framework. That's a little more difficult for an SMB. It's that philosophical shift than it is the technical shift. When you get into the enterprise space, I chuckle a little bit because, a true enterprise organization, there's probably some transfer to cloud. There's a hybrid model. There's usually areas of the estate that they don't remember they had, a dev spun up somewhere here or a test environment there, or a super user that they forgot, transferred offices 4 years ago. It's a lot messier to understand and really push through and create that, in essence, roadmap to zero trust. So I think it's something that you need to look at enterprise by enterprise. And when you have those Frankensteinian environments, take it in chunks of, can I just look at it from this perspective? Can I only turn it on in this, subset of the environment, and then grow it when true visibility is achieved? I feel like I've been talking a lot, Dave. You should shut me up halfway through this. But did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the same for every person, right? So again, regardless of, because it's zero trust is an architecture and a philosophy, I think our fundamental principle in philosophy that we agreed on, very early, was that cybersecurity starts with risk assessment. So based on the organization and based on the assessment of risk, looking to achieve a zero trust philosophy around that risk is what is crucial and critical. And that's not going to be the same for every organization, and it will fluctuate and vary the requirements accordingly. I think that's kind of where we are.
And this goes back to into the point of, 80% of organizations protect the wrong crown jewels. Mm-hmm. So again, if you don't have visibility in your architecture and understanding of what's where, if you don't have a clean cut understanding of what actually are your crown jewels, that it may not be, if you're a manufacturing company, the recipes to make your products, but it might be your M&A activity of who you're going to look at acquiring next. Those are very different types of data that you need to look at conserving and preserving. And if you don't have a handle on that, then, a road to zero trust is going to be really tough.
Yeah, visibility and understanding what data is where. Yeah, it's a really good point. Something else, and I'm going to deviate a little bit, but I think it's because we're talking about zero trust, I think this particular topic gets brushed under the rug a little bit, and that's secure DevOps. But somebody asked me the other day, hey, well, you talk to us a lot about cybersecurity, but what about, we have a digital application development wing of our business, and, how does cybersecurity fit into that? And I was like, well, that's a great question, but it's all data at the end of the day on the customer side, right? They're consuming an application that's developed, and then they're going to put in data that might be sensitive or not sensitive. And then as soon as I was about to say it, I caught myself and I was like, oh my word, what about actually secure development and secure systems engineering? Like, those are all things that, people need to start talking about a lot more. What's your kind of opinion on the secure DevOps concept and helping avoid supply chain attacks? SolarWinds, right, might have helped potentially. Where do you kind of stand on the whole thing? And how do you think that plays into, people that do custom development and zero trust? Does that need to be brought into scope?
It 100% does. So the critical thing is that DevSecOps, DevOps, whatever you want to call it, has traditionally been kind of outside the perimeter of enterprise security. It's handled, to your point, a bit differently. And we have to stop doing that. There's a traditional push-pull between DevOps and security of, well, I got to spin it up rapidly and it's just in dev and you're okay and I don't need to put the same controls around it. But the hard-learned lesson is that many times there's back doors into production or people forget it's there. And then all of a sudden, it's used as a way to get into the users that have access to it. So to your point, we have to stop the silotization of enterprise and, in essence, simplify. Data is data, users are users, security is security, one size fits all. We fix and secure everything.
So from your perspective, code is just another form of data, which obviously it's like, it seems so obvious when you say it, right? But I think you'd be surprised how many people might disagree on the face of it and then have to come back around.
It's a church and state, 100%. I've said this before, and I've had people get red in the face and be like, "You don't know what you're talking about." No, I do. I understand your code's really important. It's probably really pretty. Maybe with some lipstick, I'd take it out on a date. But the reality is, it's still just data.
Well, you must really like some developers that if you're willing to date their code. I don't know that I could ever say that personally, but
I love my developers. They're amazing and they have great code. So yes, I'm totally willing to date my code, but my husband might get mad at me. So
yeah, you're right. It's data, right? It sits on a disk somewhere. And in this particular case, eventually that data is going to have a usage. And if that usage can be a vulnerability to our customers or our business, then there's risk there, and we need to start talking about it and do something about it. And I think that supply chain attacks and the increase of them just illustrate that in real life.
Let's unpack SolarWinds for a second. I mean, SolarWinds, the heart of the matter is somebody corrupted code. That's the start of SolarWinds. Exactly what we're talking about was the start of SolarWinds. There was a piece of code that got corrupted and was injected into the software after the point that normally things would be considered trusted. That's how this whole thing started. So that anyone at this point would stand on their laurels and say that you have to treat DevOps separately is just bracing themselves for an attack. We have to get away from silotization of organizations.
Yeah. And so when you put it in perspective like that, my initial argument to well, hey, what about applications? What can you tell our developers when I said, well, it's all just data. I did say it, and it was funny because it was immediately misunderstood. It was, well, that just means that all the same security controls apply. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you.
That's exactly.
It's not different.
You have to look at your applications. If you have legacy applications running in your environment that may not be able to be protected and updated the way that some of our more robust, newer apps can, everybody's got homegrown stuff in their environment, just the nature of the beast. And as you start talking about enterprise, again, dirty little secret, wave the white flag. They have things that are to some degree vulnerable or unprotectable in their estate. You have to start looking at, something that's kind of funny, but not only again from a visibility perspective, but how are you defending those? It goes right back down to web application firewalls and shielding, which we haven't talked about as a robust security or a defense in depth strategy, more of a commoditization in years. So take visibility, and then from there, the education of what actually is vulnerable, and then how do you protect it from the inside out and from the outside in.
And looking at both, it's not good enough just to look at one, right? You got to look at both, from the outside in and from the inside out.
You have to look at both. Yeah. And that's probably this whole shift from static event-driven security to dynamic relational-based security. Mm-hmm. And I've said it time and time again, I think is probably the most fundamental shift we've seen in a decade. And it's come not subtly, it's come like a bullet train racing through the enterprise space, the government space, and now the SMB space in a matter of months, not years.
Right. Like a gale force wind, right? Just rolled through like the east wind. And we had to, sadly, instead of, bracing for it and building stronger houses, we had to pick up some of the rubble in a few cases. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%.
It's a shame. Somebody will appreciate that analogy. I'm not sure who it'll be, but somebody will.
Oh, somebody will have an opinion on it. I love those opinions. It's super fun. Can't wait.
So, hey, since we're talking about current events, I just wanted to bring up this executive order real quick, if you don't mind. I mean, do you have a quick blurb on this? What's your take on this whole thing? And what's your opinion as another colleague who speaks to CISOs regularly? Like, what are you saying to people?
Well, last time I checked, Dave, I was a CISO at one point in my career. So
I agree with that as well.
I'm teasing you. Totally teasing. I'm really happy that the EO came out. I've been watching closely the directives from CISA and the CVEs that have culminated in the past year. And the sad fact is we are at war. We are in the middle of a cyber war. And we have to recognize that. We have more nation state activity. We have more large scale criminal enterprise activity. Ransomware is up 300%. And the hackers and the nation states are really capitalizing on, to your point, this gale force wind bullet train, whatever you want to call it, that has come through our enterprises as we try and adjust to a much more dynamic digital world. So I was very pleased that the Biden administration put a line in the sand with the EO to say, okay, we need to address this head on. We need the support of public and private sector, and we need to get a handle on what can we do collaboratively to strengthen our environments and ensure our critical national infrastructure. And if you read it, what have we been talking about this whole time? It's visibility. And so, to see a lot of what was crafted in the EO kind of go through the themes we've talked about today, I think it's a very positive step in the right direction. And I'm interested to see the reaction over the next couple of months of how it all plays out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cybersecurity intelligence and maturity. To amend my earlier statement about not had its day in the sun, I think I was more referring to the need for intelligent cybersecurity and intelligent cybersecurity implementations that are based on risk and evaluation, as opposed to cybersecurity tools have their day in the sun. And I think that, let's call it appropriate cybersecurity and mitigation, I think is long overdue. And I think it's a global issue, which I don't know, just given how long the internet has been around and how often we all spend in front of a computer, I guess I'm a little bit surprised that it's taken this long to come to even this level.
I'll tell you, it's interesting you say that. One of my mentors was one of the first, in essence, founders or creators of ARPANET and the TCP/IP protocol. And, he is considered, quote unquote, one of the fathers of the internet. And I asked him once, and I said, Vint, what do you think? Did you ever think the internet would get to be the way it is today? And he paused, and it was very sad. And this has always stuck with me. He said, Kate, I don't know if I had a crystal ball and I really understood the damage and the criminal behavior that our inventions would potentially lead to, if I would do it all again. Mm. And that's been a little bit of a rally cry for me of, why nobody ever grows up and raises their hand and says they want to be a cybersecurity practitioner. Well, maybe my son, but that's because he's weird and he has grown up with cyber in the house. But it's a calling. It's a calling to do better in life. And to your point, the day in the sun is not saying, oh, everybody needs more cyber. It's a question of that day of reckoning where we realize that we've made the world a safer place and we've turned the tide from this, continual rise of threat.
That's interesting. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, this has been awesome. And I think that we are in one of those unfortunate circumstances where we could talk about this until we turn blue.
You were getting a little altruistic, so we should probably wrap it up while we're still talking about data and bits and bytes and whether or not we have enough visibility and how cool vArmour is. I totally agree.
I was getting altruistic. You're talking about making the world a better place, which, by the way, I think is fantastic. So we're going to go altruistic.
That's my rally cry. I always say, develop world-class teams and make the world a safer place. The two things I like to pick.
Is there anything that, in terms of vArmour and what's on the truck or the roadmap, that you really just want to share with the audience before we close up?
I would challenge everybody in your audience. If you have not taken a look at vArmour, you should totally take a look at vArmour. I'm easy to find. I'm Kate at vArmour.com. I'm happy to talk to any of your listeners, but what's on the truck? Identity. I'm super proud of our new identity module that we launched for Application Controller this past fall. To your point, this idea of inside out and outside in is something that we need to focus on, not only from an application, but an identity perspective. And how we've been able to do that is something I am beyond excited to share with as many customers and enterprises as possible. What's coming next? Wow, keep a look for us. Watch us on Twitter, hang out with us on LinkedIn, look at our website. We have some exciting announcements coming in the next couple of months about some of our new releases. So just keep checking us out. And thank you, Dave, for the time today. It's been awesome.
We were so glad that you could come and join us, and you gave us some time to talk about this stuff. We're super excited about it. If you want a closer look at vArmour, you can always get us at Anexinet.com. We'll get you connected with people that can help. You can always reach out to any of us or find the folks that talk here on the podcast on social media, and we'll be more than willing to set up a call and get you rocking and rolling. But Kate, it was great conversation. We're super happy that you guys are a partner of ours, and we're, killing it in the market together, and hope to be talking to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks for the time, Dave. Appreciate it.